Johannes Escudero. Welcome to the podcast.
Peter, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Tell us about the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas.
So, the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas is a 501c6 nonprofit organization, similarly organized as a trade association. Other famous C6s, the NFL, PGA come to mind, right? So, we were organized specifically July 7th, 2011. My co founder, David Cox, and I filed articles of incorporation to found the organization to really build out a policy platform and give the renewable gas industry at that time an advocacy voice. So today we employ 18 full-time staff who work daily to advance our mission. We represent 394 companies, including leading operators across the industry's value and supply chain, all working together to advance our shared mission, which is the story I love to tell. We work through effective leadership, education, advocate for sustainable development, deployment, and utilization of renewable natural gas. And that is inextricably linked with our why. And so everything we do is filtered through, will it advance our mission, and will it not just for present, but also for future generations, help secure domestic renewable clean fuel energy and products. So that's why we exist. We're active currently at the federal, state, provincial levels in terms of providing thought leadership, weighing in with public education and advocacy in North America. And some of that information experience translates around the world as well. So look forward to sharing a bit of our history and mission and vision and what we are all committed to doing on your show for the benefit of your listening audience.
Oh, it's super exciting. And as an investment banker, we're seeing a lot of deals in the RNG segment. It's really exciting. As you said, we talked in the pre-show, it's an overnight success, 12 years in the making and maybe even longer for this industry, but it really seems like it has a ton of momentum. Have you seen sort of a momentum increase over the last, call it 3 or 4 years, or has it been pretty steady since you got into it?
You're right. It's certainly an overnight success that's taken no less than 12 years. And we certainly can't take credit for all the momentum that our industry is enjoying today. We've probably catalyzed and can take some line share credit there. But when you look back at the history of it, as best we can identify, the first renewable gas facility in North America was built in 1982, almost 41 years ago. And that facility is still operating. I think that's a testament in and of itself at the Fresh Fuels landfill in Staten Island, New York. And so renewable gas from that facility is delivered to hundreds of thousands of satisfied customers to this day in the Northeast. But between that first facility in 1982 and our founding in 2011, 30 years later, industry only managed to construct, develop, and operate successfully 30 additional RNG facilities. And so over a 3-decade span, there were 31 facilities to point to, and it's largely an explanation for why the general public was not aware of our industry, much less the commodity that we were producing or the environmental benefits that we were helping to realize. So we believed in the value proposition that our industry represented at the time. And there were only 6 developers in all of North America. And we were able to sit around a table and identify where the needs were for David and my purposes as entrepreneurs. Number one, the fact that there was no trade association, there was no voice, there was no platform. So we set out quickly to solve that. And that's the introduction of the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas, or the RNG Coalition, as we're referred to shorthand. We've come a long way since then. In the last 12 years, I mentioned when we started, there were 31 facilities. Through effective leadership, education, advocacy, we were able to quadruple that 3-decade-old annual production average from 1 to 4, such that as we delivered our opening keynote at our December conference in 2015, we had 47 operating facilities, much to the surprise of our industry stakeholders, which still wasn't much more than 100 folks or so in attendance at our annual leadership conference that year. But we knew we were onto something. It was enough of an advancement to speak to our credibility as a young organization, what we were capable of doing, but more importantly, what the industry was capable of doing. And so we challenged ourselves again. We said, look, 47 operating facilities is incredible compared to our industry's past 3-decade history. but there's so much more we can do. And we made a commitment then that we've reiterated every year since. And that is, if we do our job as an organization, again, through effective leadership, education, and advocacy, we're going to create market opportunities that allow industry to leverage, to compete for, take advantage of. And so we challenged the space to double the number of facilities in 2015 from 47 to 100 by the year 2025. And again, as a fairly young organization, as new leaders of that organization, there was certainly some healthy skepticism. A lot of folks thought, here these guys go again. They've bitten off more than they could chew this time. But we realized it was more than what we were able to do. We knew what the industry was capable of. So again, weighing in on dozens of bills and state legislative bodies across the country and chiming in, putting them frequent flyer miles in, wearing shoe leather out, testifying before regulatory agencies, we were able to make a difference. And we actually achieved our 2025 target 5.5 years ahead of schedule. And we brought our 100th facility online in July of 2019. And so again, we found ourselves in Dana Point at our end of year RNG conference. And during our opening keynote, we announced our new sustainable methane abatement and recycling timeline, or our SMART initiative, which is to capture and control methane from more than 43,000 aggregated organic waste sites across North America. And we want to do that by 2050. So there's 4,400 landfills, 17,000 wastewater treatment plants, at least 19,000 larger farms, livestock, agricultural operations, where in best cases, methane is captured and destroyed, and maybe a small percentage of that is used to generate renewable electricity that then powers the operations on site. But in worst cases, and in most cases, that methane is just flared. It's literally venting directly into the atmosphere, whereas a short-lived climate pollutant, we know it's many times more potent than carbon on a life cycle basis. So we have cataloged 43,000 sites, and we've established benchmarks for 2025, 2030, 2040 with our membership to make sure we are on the proper trajectory to meet our SMART timeline by the mid-century point. So yes, we're seeing a lot of momentum in the last 4 or 5 years, probably in terms of acquisitions. When you quantify the billions of dollars that companies like WM and AstraZeneca and BMW and Mercedes and other, I shouldn't start Starbucks and Unilever, and I shouldn't start L'Oreal and others. The general public is awakening to the reality of the waste problem we have as a society. And the fact is, Peter, World Bank estimates that by 2050, organic waste is going to increase 70%. And that's with all of our efforts to reduce, reuse, recycle, our energy efficiency programs and mandates and climate change, renewable energy objectives, ESG benchmarks that have been established. We're still producing an incredibly high volume of waste. And for decades, we would export that growing problem to other countries like China and to India, who ironically now are fed up and are refusing our refuse. And it's forcing us as a country and as a continent to reconcile, what are we doing with the waste we produce as households, as businesses, right? And we know one thing is for sure: whether waste is disposed of at a landfill, whether we're composting it, whether we're diverting it to a digester, which I think is preferred, that organic waste is going to biodegrade naturally. And as part of that decomposition, methane gas and CO2 and at least 17 other gas constituents are produced. And so our industry really steps in as an incredible add value proposition to not only capture and mitigate the otherwise inevitable harmful emissions and environmental impacts, but then take it a step further, which is then convert those captured emissions into an asset in the form of renewable energy, be that fuel, heat, power products, or other services. So we are seeing incredible momentum. We're incredibly proud of the work our organization and industry have led over the last 12 to 30 years. But as we often remind ourselves, we can only be proud to the extent we're looking backwards. And both as an industry and organization, our focus is fixed on the future and the incredible and enormous work that still lies ahead.
That is amazing. The growth is unbelievable, and you guys are not resting. You want to do even bigger than what you've done in the past. So, whenever I hear renewable natural gas, I think waste to energy, or I think biogas. Could you explain sort of the difference? Are they
Absolutely.
all the same, or did you guys do a little term invention here?
Well, it's no longer the same. Certainly when we started in 2012, everything was referred to as biogas for sure. And I think internationally, depending on translation, many countries still refer to it as biogas or biomethane or biomethane, gazo renovable, whatever the case may be. But in 2012, as we were advancing Assembly Bill 1900, the first bill we introduced in the California state legislature, which was to, by the way, fix 25-year-old statute such that biogas, as it was referred to at the time, could be upgraded and injected into California's natural gas pipelines from our own in-state resources. There's a whole history there that we probably should touch on. We can come back to that if you want. I don't want to lose sight of your question, and I want to address that first. But there's an interesting story there. So yeah, almost everything was referred to as biogas in 2012. But again, in advancing Assembly Bill 1900, we had to differentiate the raw biogas, which I referred to earlier, is a gas stream comprised of at least 17 different constituents, right? Methane, CO2, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, there's volatile organic compounds, siloxanes, all informed by the waste stream, right? It's a little bit different gas mixture if it's coming from a landfill versus a wastewater treatment plant versus a livestock agriculture operation. But in any case, the resulting emissions are biogas. And so in 2012, most biogas was actually captured and then combusted to create renewable electricity. Now, why was that happening? That was not just voluntarily the goodwill, although there was a lot of goodwill deployed. That was driven by state programs, renewable portfolio standards that required the capture of this biogas and the generation of a certain amount of electricity from renewable sources, which biogas met the criteria for. So we coined the term renewable natural gas intentionally to differentiate the raw biogas from the upgraded product gas. But you'll notice a similarity between renewable natural gas and what society is most familiar with as conventional natural gas or fossil natural gas, because molecularly they're very similar, such that you can use RNG as a drop-in fuel in existing natural gas appliances, pipelines, engines, vehicles. But the difference is one is renewable, the other isn't. And so unlike conventional natural gas, which deploys controversial technology, hydraulic fracturing or fracking, renewable natural gas facilities actually capture methane from surface level biogenic emissions. So that's a key component, key difference there between an RNG and conventional natural gas. But we have an incredible opportunity. Instead of just stranding existing natural gas infrastructure and assets, we can actually incrementally decarbonize that infrastructure by deploying renewable gas through those systems across the country and around the world.
It's incredible. And of course, any gas or renewable natural gas or fossil gas is combustible and you can have access to it on demand, which I think is critical. We love wind and solar, but it's an intermittent resource. And so I always say to people, when you turn your light switch on, you want the lights to come, 100% of the time, not 35 or 40% of the time. So it's critical we have dispatchable resources. And so I imagine you see renewable natural gas playing a huge role in that regard.
We do. And you hit the proverbial nail on the head. And we never speak disparagingly about the other intermittent renewable energy resources like wind and solar, because I think there's truly an opportunity in North America to learn from other countries who in many respects are light years ahead of us in terms of really perfecting the circular economy. And so there really it shouldn't be a competition, although you can argue that federal and state governments in certain regions are certainly identifying their political preferences, and a lot of the incentives exist for wind and solar, but there's not an insignificant volume of renewable natural gas that can be developed and deployed to decarbonize our energy supply. I mean, today there's enough RNG just from our organic waste streams to replace 13% of total current gas demand in all the United States. So for context, that's enough RNG that you could supply and decarbonize 100% of current commercial gas demand, which equates to about 75% of current residential demand and about 45% of industrial demand. That's just the United States. If we look at Canada, there's enough RNG potential to supply and decarbonize 10% of all commercial demand and about 10% of residential demand there too. So not an insignificant volume. And certainly RNG is not a single solution for our energy transition to completely decarbonize, but it's a significant percentage that we can't ignore it. And furthermore, we're addressing a waste management problem, right? We're improving waste collection, waste management processes. We're addressing what we do with the waste we're producing as a society. And again, not just mitigating the harmful environmental impacts and by reducing and eliminating emissions, but converting it to an energy asset, right? To further decarbonize transportation, fuel, heat. For example, we're providing RNG that completely heats Seattle Tacoma International Airport's terminals. We're really proud of that. There's difficult to electrify sectors like buildings. And we're able to use RNG to displace conventional natural gas to provide that renewable source of heat. So agreed. I think a truly resilient energy portfolio is a diverse portfolio. And so, yeah, we're just excited that general public is increasingly recognizing the environmental and economic benefits associated with increased RNG use.
No, I appreciate that. So let's talk projects a little bit. Being an investment banker, we see a lot of projects, and this, we're a small subset of the overall market in terms of what we see. We increasingly see a little bit of a move from what I would call dairy feedstocks, which I think have been extremely popular over the last, call it 4 or 5 years. And we're now starting to see other types of feedstocks increasingly, as you mentioned, wastewater treatment, other types of feedstocks. I don't want to ask you to pick any winners, but are there feedstocks that you're seeing emerge, let's say over the next 3 to 5 years, that are maybe a little bit different from previous five?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when we look at these numbers are moving targets. We just announced July 31st, facility number 300 came online. We're incredibly proud of that. That suggests that given the 184 projects that are under construction as you and I are speaking today, and an additional 298 RNG facilities that are in various stages of development, that we're going to exceed our benchmark, our SMART initiative benchmark for 2025. And so these are moving numbers, right? As you and I are talking, I mentioned 298 projects under development. Those come from a variety of feedstocks. It's approximately 45% still landfills, right? Because there's 4,400 landfills that don't have RNG facilities on them today. About 32% of facilities under construction are coming from manure, whether that's principally going to be dairy manure, but there's some swine manure as well. And about 14% is coming from food waste. So increasingly states are mandating the diversion of organic waste away from landfills. And so a lot of those states are figuring out where to send that diverted waste. And we're advocating that it be disposed of in digesters, and that incentives be provided for industry to build those digesters, to house that waste, to capture the resulting emissions. And then about 9% today is coming from wastewater treatment plants. So will that shift? I mean, when we look at the segment of facilities that have substantially completed development, the numbers still hold true in that same order. It's still mostly coming from landfill, then manure, then food waste and wastewater treatment plants. And I think some of that is, there's a number of factors, right? Anytime you're looking at a wastewater treatment plant, and this is true of landfills too, but usually the gas rights or the landfill is municipally, or the wastewater treatment plant, I should say, is municipally operated. And so anytime a developer wants to build an RNG facility, there's a whole public process. So the process takes longer, it's slower. And so some of the other feedstocks represent lower hanging fruit, so to speak. But in terms of picking a winner, we're only winning if we're capturing the methane from every feedstock where organic waste is disposed of. So we don't have a favorite. If you're asking a developer that question, if you're asking that on behalf of the investment banking community, probably there's a preference towards landfills. On one hand, it's a stationary and the largest stationary feedstock source. On the other hand, there's other economic factors to consider, including the value of the gas from the landfill, which is not equal across the board. There are federal, state, and provincial incentives, program requirements. There's the GREET model. There's carbon intensity of fuel that all has to be taken into consideration as part of a calculus that determines how much in the market value for the resulting RNG based on where it comes from, how far you have to transport it from production to end use. All that is quantified and taken into consideration in terms of the valuation of the product. So again, we only win if we're capturing methane from every single source. And that's our goal as part of our SMART timeline.
Very helpful. So I'd be crazy as a finance guy if I didn't ask some finance questions. So one of the challenges we see across the board, not just with renewable natural gas project, but with all projects, is new developers have challenges financing pre-construction development costs. So, every in the world wants to invest in construction, but they're very hesitant to invest in greenfield projects before construction. But there are a lot of development costs there. In terms of what you're seeing out there, um, and we think of newer developers, let's say developers that have built less than 10 projects or don't already have a balance sheet. What are some of the ways you're seeing these developers get their projects financed? And do you see those pre-construction costs as a challenge to getting more projects?
Certainly, it's a factor that developers are having to take into consideration, and every developer's financial situation is unique. We have scenarios where developers are bringing closely held family money. In other cases, successful developers through the decades have been able to leverage that experience, expertise, that credit worthiness and balance, and maybe have an easier time than a brand new developer who doesn't have any track record to speak of. So that's true in terms of challenges. I would say most of the challenges that we're facing are of a political nature. Certainly on the practical side, on the technical side, COVID had an impact on manufacturing timeline of deliverability, and certainly that all plays a part. Delayed timelines is a cost, and all that has to be factored in. So, but yeah, I mean, in terms of the beautiful thing about renewable natural gas is it resonates with both sides of the aisle. When we're talking with representatives in the House or Senate or in state legislative bodies, if it's a conservative member or a liberal member, we're going to focus on either the economic or the environmental benefits. If it's someone who's middle road and interested in job creation, we're going to lay it all out for them. Um, we really don't have any detractors to speak of, with the exception of a very small, well, I shouldn't say small. They're certainly vociferous and they punch above their weight, but the Earth Justice Organization has certainly fought us largely because of our support for RNG production from dairy manure. And they've been clear and in no uncertain terms have offered to withdraw their opposition in certain advocacy arenas on certain measures if we would remove our support for that. And we just can't do that. Outside of transportation, farms account for the second largest source of methane emissions that we feel compelled as an industry to help mitigate. So that's a non-starter for us. And to that point, you just can't convince everybody that what we're doing is right. For some folks, it's almost religious. And when it gets to that point, there's no amount of information you could deploy to bridge the education gap that exists. So what we focus on is educating lawmakers and regulators and the general public. And I'll tell you what, we have within our membership, I think 15 or 16 colleges and universities. So we've had significant opportunity to connect with the next generation of leaders that's currently enrolled in college or at university, and to see the lights go on in their eyes when we talk about the circular economy that RNG production supports and is part of. It gives us great confidence for the future that the next generation sees beyond all the political propaganda that's out there. And that's really encouraging, right? And again, we support and think that a truly diverse energy portfolio is critical to resilience, to energy independence, security, and especially in light of world dynamics happening seemingly all around us and on all fronts, right? So at some point, we have to stop picking winners and losers, and we have to identify the opportunity to really deploy all the assets at our disposal, so to speak, every pun intended.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I put out hashtag and not or all the time around these different technologies, because you see these debates on LinkedIn and online as people argue for their favorite technology. But in the end, if we're going to do energy transition, it's such a huge problem. We've got to deploy everything at our
Yeah.
disposal.
Absolutely. I'll give you a case in point. We support, again, RNG or biogas to electricity production. That was our origin, right? So the notion that to support or be pro RNG from a policy position is to take a position that's counter to a pro electrification position is just not true. The problem is when we want to electrify everything at the expense of all other immediately available and more cost effective technologies. That's where we take umbrage. And a case in point is, when jurisdictions, cities decide that they're going to ban natural gas hookups for all new build. We don't even weigh in, right? We don't even bother fighting that fight. Fine. If that's the choice the community wants to make and their support for it, It's when they start wanting to retroactively go back and ban natural gas hookups at existing facilities that we have a problem with that, right? We shouldn't put all of our eggs in one basket. And whether that's, we preach and support diversity in every context except for energy, right? We want it all to come from electricity. Well, that's a problem, right? That creates a liability for a number of reasons, right? In terms of grid capacity, load, cost, reliability, especially across the country. You look at the intermittency and different weather patterns, and you don't have to look too far past the recent weather patterns to recognize what a disaster that can be. And then you talk about electric vehicles. I'm in Silicon Valley. I'm in Palo Alto, the heartbeat home of Tesla and Rivian and Lucid. And my wife drives a hybrid. And we support electric vehicles. But the notion that an electric vehicle is automatically cleaner than an internal combustion engine because it's operating on a battery is just, it's ignorant, right? Where is that battery manufactured? What rare minerals were mined and with what child labor? And what's the carbon footprint of the ship to bring those rare minerals to market from various sources around the world? And then what is the battery life? Where is the battery disposed of? And look, again, you can use biogas or RNG. You can combust it to create electricity to charge those vehicles. So we support that. But again, I think because there isn't a tailpipe on electric vehicles, a lot of times the general public is misled to believe that there are no emissions, when emissions really have to be considered and calculated on a life cycle basis. Where is that electricity coming from? You may be driving an emissions-free electric vehicle, but the electricity generated may be responsible for an incredible source of emissions at the actual power plant site, right? So again, we aren't speaking disparagingly of any other intermittent renewable energy resource. We just want to raise the level of public education and awareness so that we can inform our elected officials, legislators, regulators about the kinds of policies that really represent common sense and the general public's best interest.
And that makes huge sense. And I think people are starting to understand it. I mean, I think there's been a good amount of work done online that electricity just doesn't come from the plug, right? It has to come from somewhere. And, just, energy economics, I think is something people are starting to learn, which is great.
Well, our young children sometimes think that produce, fruits and vegetables all comes from the grocery store, right? It does, but it's grown and harvested somewhere first, right? So
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy, and that's a good way to teach it for sure. So you mentioned policies that you guys are advocating for. What are some of the policies you think are common sense or good policies to help advance the industry, the renewable natural gas industry?
there's a whole suite of policy options that we're constantly advocating for, tweaking, expanding that include key programs that are in place today. Again, with a credit to the amount of work that our organization has done over the last 12 years, namely the renewable fuel standard at the federal level. That's a program that requires oil refiners to produce a certain percentage of fuel from renewable resources. That is created incredible investment and would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the key role that companies like Shell and BP and Chevron and others have played, not only by joining and providing membership support through our organization for our shared mission, but in the actual investment, the joint ventures that they've entered into, the trading desk where they're actually marketing the environmental credits that are associated with every ethanol gallon equivalent of renewable gas that's produced, that is helping spur innovation and construction of new facilities, and statewide programs like California's world leading low carbon fuel standard, right? Assembly Bill 32 was passed in 2000. Fabian Nunez and Fran Pavlik, David, my co-founder, and I actually had our fingerprints and helped draft some of that language back before the coalition existed. And then 10 years later, in 2016, 5 years into operating the RNG coalition, we once again had a chance to advocate and influence passage of Senate Bill 32 by Fran Pavley, who was then a state senator, to extend the authority that allowed California's Air Resources Board to promulgate the low carbon fuel standard. And then we've been able to replicate that LCFS program in Oregon, Washington, and we've got key legislation making its way through the gauntlet in a half dozen other states like New Mexico, Colorado, Minnesota, Michigan, New York, and New Jersey in no particular order. And again, low carbon fuel standards have been a key policy driver responsible for our industry growth, at least with respect to deploying RNG to the transportation market, right? I mentioned when we started in 2011, almost 100% of all RNG or biogas at the time was used as a feedstock to generate renewable electricity. But that isn't coincidental, right? That wasn't just because it was influenced by federal tax incentives, Section 29 and later Section 45, and later a variety of state renewable portfolio standard or RPS programs, of which there are now 37 different state varieties. And so with the advent of July 14, 2014, we were able to effectively advocate for the inclusion of RNG feedstocks under the federal renewable fuel standard that I just mentioned. And that was a game changer. So we went from 100% of RNG being used to generate power in 2011 to today, less than 20% is being used to generate electric power. The balance is going to the transportation fuel market. And again, that's driven largely by the federal RFS and state LCFS program. So those are probably the top two. And then we're constantly advocating for renewable gas standard procurement requirements that by state or region require natural gas utility companies to procure a certain percentage of their total throughput, displacing conventional natural gas with renewable natural gas. And companies like SoCalGas and PG&E and others across the country have demonstrated incredible leadership by stepping away from what they were familiar with and embracing the incredible opportunity that RNG represents in that regard.
That's incredible. So in some of the projects we've worked on and heard about, so we think of three revenue streams. We think of the gas itself or the value of the underlying gas, which we're typically seeing trade at something like the Henry Hub price.
$3. Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
it'll spike every once in a while and you get a little bit more for it, but gas in this country is cheap. It's much cheaper than in other countries. And then we see the LCFS and then we see the RIN in terms of
Correct.
the overall value stream of the RNG. And we've heard things that some of these other incentives have not been as lucrative as they have in the past, or they've been fluctuating. And I'm wondering if any policy advocacy can be done to sort of prove the value of those, or if you feel overall for most developers right now, maybe there is sufficient value streams, or if you're maybe bring some change.
Yeah. So I think it's impossible for renewable natural gas to compete directly with conventional natural gas prices. You mentioned Henry Hub, which is kind of an industry standard reference, right? Which is somewhere in the $2.50, $3 per MMBTU price range, right? Well, the cost to develop and produce renewable natural gas is on a magnitude of multiple times that, such that in order to successfully operate and deploy RNG to market and create a market for it, you have to have economic incentives in place. And that's where the RFS, the LCFS come into play. You mentioned the RIN. RIN is shorthand for Renewable Identification Number. And a RIN is assigned to every ethanol gallon equivalent of renewable fuel that's produced, right? So there's approximately 11.727 RINs. That calculus is likely to change under the current biogas regulatory reforms that are in process, which is administered by the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level. But again, to date, it's been 11.727 RINs per MMBTU, right? Which you can then monetize through transactions on the RFS market or RIN market. The low carbon fuel standard is a little bit different. It doesn't incent production of renewable fuel. It incents reduction of the carbon intensity of fuel. And so there is a credit that's awarded per ton of carbon reduced. And that does fluctuate as well. So as most markets, right? Price points are seldom ever fixed. And we understand the difficulty that places the investment community. And what does an investor want? What does a developer want, who is throughout our industry history largely been the investor, right? They're on the hook for everything. They've got to go out and access the capital, then they've got to leverage it and they got to provide a return on it. And we understand that they need certainty and predictability. So we're trying to create that through effective advocacy and education by not only, again, protecting, expanding existing markets, but creating new and diverse market demand like we did with SB 32 in the LCFS context, right? That extended the authority for the program beyond 2020 to 2030. And I suspect before 2030 in California, we're going to see legislation that mandates the extension of the LCFS probably to the mid-century point, or at least an alternate program that encompasses the LCFS. But anytime you're successful to some degree, what's the adage? Success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. And I think commensurate with the modicum of success we've enjoyed, there's always a detractor out there that wants to tear you down or tear it down, and we're seeing some of that in an advocacy front, right? There's organizations out there that want to see less RNG used in an LCFS context, which is just asinine to me and just speaks to a lack of understanding and education about the value proposition our industry is playing on a life cycle basis, right? And so I digress a little bit, but hopefully that answered your question there.
No, it's really helpful. Another thing we're starting to see is a little bit of competition in the transport market, very early, very nascent, but for hydrogen. So
Yeah,
figuring out, and we've even heard RNG may end up, people may use it to convert to hydrogen or produce hydrogen. We're hearing a lot of noise in the market, let's say.
it's happening already. Yeah. Look, don't get me wrong. And prior to founding the coalition in 2012, David and I spent close to a decade in the state capitol, and we did a significant amount of work. Personally, I staffed the transportation committee. And so the sort of the joke around the Capitol was that hydrogen is the fuel of the future, and it always will be. Obviously, Jerry Brown, I think, took that serious. And during his tenure, through executive action, through legislation that he signed, I think has pretty much guaranteed a path forward for hydrogen. Of course, as renewable hydrogen advocates, and we're not alone, there's other stakeholders that have clamored along to help define what renewable hydrogen is. There's been no shortage of obfuscation in the market with the whole color palette of whether it's green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gray, brown, purple hydrogen. What is renewable hydrogen versus non renewable hydrogen? It's been a little bit of a cluster. So we're trying to provide some leadership and clarity there. We absolutely support renewable natural gas as a feedstock, as a biointermediate, including to support the production of renewable hydrogen. I think there's a case to be made, right? I think for some time utilities were even considering, how much hydrogen can we put in our pipelines? Well, there's embrittlement issues, and that's going to vary across service territory. But with the advent of steam methane reformation, you can actually use the pipelines to store RNG and then pull the RNG off the pipeline and through SMR, convert that RNG to renewable hydrogen in a much more cost effective and safe manner. So we're excited about that. We've been advocating for renewable hydrogen since about 2020. You could make the case that we aren't just the renewable natural gas coalition, we're the renewable gas coalition because of the efficacy that and the success we've enjoyed on not just the biogas, RNG, and renewable hydrogen fronts, but including and increasingly CO2, which is another gas constituent that our developers are having to mitigate and address on site as they're developing projects at various feedstock locations. And again, we feel incumbent upon us as an organization to the extent we can predict regulatory agencies are going to require our developers to address the CO2 streams at each of our facilities, that it's incumbent upon us to get ahead of that curve and through education and advocacy, create market demand for what is arguably a renewably sourced CO2 stream. And when you look at the food and beverage industry, who use incredible volumes of CO2 to carbonate their food, to stun their sources of protein, it's another rabbit trail, no pun intended, we could chase there, but it's not an insignificant volume. And increasingly, the general public and thus shareholders of these companies are mandating a decarbonization and an increase in the uptick of renewable fuels that are used. And so I think the market is primed to do it. But for some time, there was some reticence, right? And for good reason. If you're talking about food and beverage, you're very conscious about what products are going into what the carbonization of a soft drink, for example. But when you look at how far technology's advanced, and you're talking about is a gas from this source versus the identical gas from an alternate source, it's a gas stream, right? Is oxygen, is it clean oxygen? Is it dirty oxygen? I think you can identify that. You can purify the air, and you can do the same thing with gas streams. So I think we're right there. We're certainly making a push for that. And I think that the prospects of market diversification and demand for not just the methane from RNG facilities, but the CO2 is going to be enormous. And I think we're seeing voluntary market respond.
Yeah,
All
the
right.
usages of CO2 are many. They can be used in different gas streams. We're hearing even innovative technologies to use the CO2, for example, in the creation of fats and other sorts of products, in the creation of plastics. We're hearing
Yes.
in different uses. So to your point about starting in the circular economy, now you're able to renew many different types of gases and make those available. And I think circular is the operative word here, because whenever that's coming into play, it's more efficient, and those streams would otherwise be wasted. And so I think it makes a ton of sense. I don't want to call you out on or put you on the spot around your members, but maybe you can
Yeah.
highlight your members that are doing some innovative things in the marketplace, both small and large companies would be great.
I can't do that by name just because, I mean, you'll have to look at the Wall Street Journal or you'll have to look at, industry trade press and renowned outlets, do a Google search and there'll be no shortage of listings of the incredible work that our industry stakeholders are doing. And these aren't just Fortune 50 companies. A lot of these are companies you've never heard of, but they're pioneering, they're advancing, improving technology innovations that all are critical component to the effective operation of a successful renewable gas facility. So I would be remiss to start naming one, two, or three because we have 394 and we wouldn't be who we are, where we're at, and our industry wouldn't be going without each of their individual and respective support. So, obviously some of the larger companies probably take up or get a lot more attention. So you'll see things, key mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures that have been formed. But behind every one of those was decades of work that a lot of the smaller and recognizable member companies should be credited for. So again, when you look across the entire value and supply chain of our industry, it takes all parts. It really does. And so to answer the question, there's just no way I could do justice by answering that. Um,
Understand your position.
yeah.
Maybe another question I could ask is, if people want to join your organization, who should be joining? What are the types of companies? What are some of the benefits that they get by being a member of the coalition?
So anyone who identifies with our mission and for whom the mission resonates such that they would like to provide support for the continual advancement of that mission, which is again, we educate, advocate for sustainable deployment and utilization of renewable natural gas so that not just present, but future generations have access to domestic renewable clean fuel products, then they should join the coalition. We have three different membership tiers. Tier eligibility is based on a company's gross annual revenues. I'm really proud to say we've only increased member dues once in our 12-year history. We've been able to sort of overcome the cost of living increases and correlating expenses that we're all subject to by volume, by growing the industry and in turn growing support for our organization. Beyond membership, and membership certainly provides access to our staff to varying degrees and opens access and enrollment in our leadership advisory boards, our labs, of which we have 5, and through which all of our policy positions are established and our public education efforts are choreographed. But beyond membership and direct member dues dollar support for our mission, we also have a smart subscriber. So maybe a company in your audience doesn't consider themselves an industry stakeholder, would never have any reason or interest to participate or invest in an RNG facility or any of the commensurate or associated products or services, but our mission resonates with them and they recognize the impact that methane and CO2 are having on our environment and climate, and they want to support, they can become a smart subscriber. And for a fraction of the cost of membership dues, they can subscribe. And so there's certain benefits that they'll get with that smart subscription that'll keep them in the loop and keep them abreast of policy developments and industry developments that keep them apprised of how we're advancing our mission.
That's great. Appreciate that. And do you guys do a conference? And is your conference open to anyone who pays or just to members, or how does that work?
So we have 4 annual events, annual industry events, I should say. The first is usually in February, March. That's our Smart Cup. It's a fantastic event. It's a golf tournament fundraiser that supports our SMART endowment, which correlates with our SMART timeline that we talked about earlier, our sustainable methane abatement recycling timeline. And then we have our RNG Summit in May. It's in the Woodlands. That's our mid-year policy update. We also have an investor forum and a pipeline access forum at Summit that meets adjacent to. We have our technical workshop and trade expo. That's at the Music City Center in Nashville, Tennessee every year, usually in September. And that's an A policy, A market forum where we're gathering to educate, demonstrate, promote industry best practices from a technical finance development operations standpoint. And then our sort of grand finale is in December with our annual leadership conference in Dana Point at the Waldorf Astoria Monarch Beach Resort. And that's where we're discussing all things relevant to pro renewable gas policy market development. And yes, to answer your question, Although registration for end of conference is so competitive, and so we limit registration to members only and leadership level members only January through June, and then advanced general members can start registering June through September. Mid-September registration opens for non-members or future members, I should say, to the extent there's still room to attend our end of year conference in December. But for our Smart Cut, our RNG Summit, and our RNG Technical Workshop Trade Expo, there's no restrictions on when, who registers. We welcome members and industry stakeholders and future members alike to participate in those events, to learn more about RNG, to figure out how they fit in and can support our shared mission.
Well, Johannes, that is pretty incredible. I don't know you put on 4 conferences a year.
We have an incredible events team of staff,
Oh my
including led
goodness.
by Sharon, our director of events. Could not do it without her. She single-handedly almost pulls these events off, and she's growing her team of support. And, you ask any one of our member stakeholders about our events, and probably her name and face come to mind for them first. But there's a lot of moving parts behind the scenes. Again, an incredible team of staff that are advancing our policy advocacy efforts at the federal, state, provincial, and legislate and state levels. And we've got our comms and marketing team, our data and research team, and David and I are incredibly built of the organization that's around us. And again, still think the best days for our industry and organization are ahead of us. So love telling our story. You never know who podcasts like yours are going to connect us with, whether it's a benefactor, a beneficiary, a partner, you just never know. And so thank you again for the opportunity to share some of that.
Well, Johannes, it's really been a pleasure having you on. Tell the audience where they can reach you. Where's your website and how can they get in touch with
Thank you so much, Peter. RNGcoalition.com is our webpage. There's a host of information, a treasure trove of additional information that's free to the public that you can access, including but not limited to our education page. Every Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern, we host a webinar that showcases an industry stakeholder, a member, and their respective role in the value or supply chain and proposition. Invite your audience to, if they want to learn more about RNG, one facet or another, so make a note on your calendar and tune in 1 o'clock Eastern almost every Wednesday throughout the year. And of course, our team of staff, our email contacts available online away, always an email or phone call away, and look forward to answering any follow-up questions you, your team, or your audience might have, Peter. So thank you again for having us.
Thank you so much. This has been Johannes Escudero, and he is with the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. It's a hot industry. And if you want to know more about it, this is a great place to start. Thanks for being on.
Of course, our honor. Thanks so much, Peter.